Hello, this is Nick Rossi for Acoustic Guitar Magazine. Say the words swing guitar, and the name Freddie Green will almost immediately spring to mind. Freddie, through 50 years of working with Count Basie and his orchestra, came to epitomize the idea of swing rhythm guitar. He was driving but light, rock solid but always swinging. But today I'm going to talk a little bit more about the world out of which Freddie emerged during the second half of the 1930s. That world was Harlem in New York City. Like many before and after, Freddie came to New York City to pursue music. In the 1930s, his opportunities as an African American were limited by the culture of the times. But Harlem provided a support structure as well as a haven for some of the best musicians to ever play this music. Born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1911, Freddie moved up to New York permanently right around 1930, just as the swing era was beginning. To explore this world, we're going to take a look at 4 players from the era and that scene, all of whom were very important, but are perhaps lesser known today. We'll examine their playing, some of their typical devices, and get into what made them unique players. One of the first guitar players to really catch the attention of Freddie Green was John Trueheart, and this was a name that Freddie mentioned several times during his life. Trueheart was born around 1903 in Virginia, and he met his longtime friend Chick Webb in Baltimore, Maryland, where the two were growing up. Webb and Trueheart moved to New York City in the mid-1920s to pursue music and quickly became important members of the Harlem scene. By the end of the 1920s, Trueheart, then a banjo player, had made the switch to guitar just as the swing era was beginning to ramp up and the rhythm sections were changing. At that point in time, it was standard issue for guitar players to play an archtop guitar, much like something like this, which the timbre which matched very well with the emerging swing band rhythm section, namely piano, upright bass, and drums, none of which were mic'd, all of which were played acoustically. John Trueheart's relaxed but driving rhythm, a key component to the Freddie Green sound, can be heard on a lot of early Chick Webb records starting in the mid-1930s. Take a listen to such records as Let's Get Together, or If Dreams May Come, or Blue Lou, or especially things like Stomping at the Savoy, and you can get a sense of John Trueheart's pulse, or beat as it was often called in those days. But, as was the case with many of these players we're going to talk about, Trueheart was also a very capable chord melody player, using chordal patterns strung together by melodic lines to both set up songs as well as play solo breaks. So today, we're going to take a look at John Trueheart's chordal introduction to a 1934 Chick Webb recording of Lonesome Moments. So let me play it first in tempo, and then we'll talk a little bit about the number. So let's talk about this. We're setting up the tune that is in the key of F, and we're working with some really basic chords that help set that up. The first riff's based on a G minor chord, played up high at the 10th fret. As is often the case, we're breaking down components of essentially a 3-note chord, playing them in 2 or 3-note groupings. Again, this is very typical of the era, and this voicing up here is very standard for the times. The next figure, the next chord that I play, is one of the most common of the swing era in terms of voicings. It's a 3-note chord, which I'm using in this case as a C6. So C, E, A. Depending on the context, this 3-note chord may be used as a 6th chord, may be used as a dominant 9 chord. It may also be used as a minor chord. And guitar players of the era very often use this as their go-to chord. The next chord that's really important to pull from this particular example is how I'm voicing this C7 chord. It's a very standard, starts with a very standard cowboy chord, C7 if you will. But I'm taking my third finger and I'm fretting the low G. And then with my middle finger, I'm muting the A string. And with my pointer finger, I'm muting the high E string. So the only notes that are sounding in this chord are the low G, the E, the B flat, and then the root note, which is played up high. But importantly, I'm striking all 6 strings. And this brings up a very interesting point about playing of the era. Before chords became a bit more streamlined mid to late decade, it was very common to hear guitar players use really big 6-note chords with 2 or so of the notes muted. This allowed the guitarist to play a big full chord as well as get some extra percussive attack. So when you hear me play here, I'm actually playing all 6 strings, although again, those are muted. So I'll play the first part of it again, and hopefully you can hear that in context. And I'm going to play it a little bit slower this time so you can see what I'm doing. There's a couple other things I should point out here. As I mentioned, John Trueheart was a banjo player. And there's a couple of devices that he is using that were very common with banjo playing in the 1920s. First, the use of chromatics. Very common banjo device. Also, the use of slides were very common with banjos as well. So you can hear a mix of banjo technique, some developing swing guitar technique, as well as some alternate picking that I'm using. Again, something that I'm pulling from the banjo tradition. So let me play that again at tempo. And there's that 3-note chord I'm using again up here. I'm using it as an F6 this time. One contemporary of John Trueheart was Bernard Bunky Addison. Roughly the same age, Addison was born in Annapolis, Maryland, and came up in the Washington, D.C. scene alongside people like Rex Stewart. He moved to New York around the same time as John Trueheart and quickly became an important part of that world. Like Trueheart, he started off on banjo and made his money playing in jazz-age rhythm sections. By the end of the decade, Addison had made the switch to guitar. Initially inspired by the success of Italian-American guitarist / crooner Nick Lucas, Addison was spurred on by informal lessons given to him by his good friend Eddie Lang. Addison was very much in demand at the time, working with people such as Jelly Roll Morton, James P. Johnson, and Louis Armstrong. But for our discussion today, we're going to take a look at Addison's rhythm sense, his beat. And nowhere can that be heard better than on the records he made with Fletcher Henderson's orchestra in 1933 and 1934. Now, I just spoke about John Trueheart, who had a very even driving beat. But Addison had a bit of a different feel. And while not entirely uncommon to the era, It is unique now when one thinks of swing rhythm guitar. So using Horace Henderson's recorded version of Happy Feet as kind of our guide, I'm going to first play a few bars of a fairly typical Bernard Addison feel. Now this is what I call a long short approach. The first and third beats are long, they roll out. The second and fourth beats, the upbeats, snap, almost like a snare drum. And it gives a little bit of a extra feel of backbeat, and it gives us just a slightly different feel to the overall rhythm character of the song. So let me play that slow, and let's talk about technically and mechanically what I'm doing to make this sound. So what's important here? The left hand. My right hand is staying loose, relaxed, and although you can see that I'm hitting the strong beats, the 1 and 3, closer to the neck, and I'm hitting the 2 and 4 closer to the bridge, which does give a slight different sound character. I'm controlling the decay of the notes with my left hand by squeezing. So for these long notes, to let them roll out, I'm keeping the notes fretted down. As I come up to hit the second and 4 beats, I'm lifting my hand up ever so slightly to choke and give that percussive effect that the guitar is so highly capable of, particularly in this context. So I'll play it a little bit more at tempo, and maybe you can take a look at what I'm doing on my left hand and listen for that quality of decay. So at its core, the kind of Bernard Addison beat, as we'll call it, is a very simple long, short, long, short. But as was common with a lot of players, particularly those that came from playing banjo a decade or so earlier, you hear extra syncopations in these chords, which is a little against the thinking of what most people conceptualize as swing rhythm guitar playing. They think of it as 4/4, and they're very right. That's what it became. That's what it became during the late 30s, and that's what Freddie Green perfected over the course of his long career. But there's other ways to get to the same goal, and that goal is to keep things swinging. So to break this down, really what Addison is doing is adding some eighth notes and adding them in accents either on the second beat of the bar or sometimes the fourth beat of the bar. And he's doing so in a real-time reaction to the music that's happening with him. He worked with the tremendous rhythm section, which included the great Walter Johnson on drums. And they would react in real time, just like you expect a drummer would. And it's important to emphasize that, the guitar was a rhythm instrument. We are striking the strings with a tiny piece of celluloid. And so there's some qualities inherent to that process that we can coax out of this instrument and help create a little more of a complex, interesting rhythm bed for the band we're playing with as well as the soloists. So I'm going to play this really slow, and we'll count out these accents, and then we'll hear them again in real time. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the basic beat. Let's put an extra eighth note on the second beat of each bar. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now you may have noticed that I was playing some upstrokes on that. That's correct. While I continue to emphasize downstrokes, particularly for the strong beats, when I'm playing these extra syncopations, I'm often doing so by using upstrokes. Not only does it provide some economy, especially on up-tempo tunes when I'm trying to keep that rhythm going, but it also has a bit of a sonic effect of just ever so slightly stroking the strings rather than so forcefully. It was pretty common of the era for players to play as such. Again, since many of them were banjo players to begin with, or had been playing banjo professionally for several years prior to the swing era. The banjo stroke, often called a jazz stroke in old instructionals from the time, consisted of alternating strokes. So let's hear that at tempo again. One quick note, you'll see that I'm using my thumb a fair amount on this. That was fairly common among players during this era to use their thumb as well. Again, to have control over all 6 of those strings without necessarily barring all 6 of the strings. So I'll try to emphasize that a little bit more in time. You'll hear that I'm going to be interspersing these additional syncopations kind of at random. And in my mind, I'm imagining playing with an orchestra and maybe a soloist blowing a chorus and reacting and giving some rhythmic emphasis to what I'm hearing. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. One aspect of Addison's playing that we did not discuss was his use of both chords as well as single strings in his solo breaks. But this is an approach that he shared with one of his contemporaries, Cab Calloway's longtime rhythm player, Morris White. Morris, or Fruit as he was known to his bandmates, was slightly younger than both Trueheart and Addison, but he also made the move to New York in the 1920s. By the end of the decade, he was playing with the Missourians, and after playing the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem, the band was paired with Cab Calloway. With the Missourians backing him, Cab Calloway shot to success, becoming one of the most important as well as popular African-American band leaders of the 1930s. White, for his part, was with Calloway through much of this period, playing in the band until late 1937, at which point in time he was replaced by Danny Barker. Morris White, again, had a banjo background, so much of his playing was informed by banjo playing while adapting to the new swing rhythms and the sense of 4/4 pulse. Due to his success, Calloway's recording sessions were afforded a lot more time and care by the White Record Company executives. Therefore, we get to hear a lot more of Morris's playing, and it gives us an opportunity to hear other approaches to swing rhythm playing. Take a listen to 1933's Harlem Camp Meeting or 1934's Moonglow, both by Cab Calloway, and you'll get a good sense of what Morris was like as a rhythm player as well as an accompanist, as he often is playing single note figures underneath Cab Calloway's vocals. But let's look a little more closely at Morris White's single string breaks on 1934's Avalon. But let's take a closer look at what Morris White plays, particularly on the solo breaks during 1934's Avalon, again recorded by Cab Calloway. First and foremost, we have to remember that this is a call and response solo section between White and the flute of Foots Thomas. I'm going to go ahead and play a little bit of the form just to set up some context, and then let's dig into what Morris played. So White plays rhythm, staying on a big D7 chord while the flute plays, and then responds with single note playing all over the G. So let's try that. Let's try that in real time first, and we'll see where we go from there. So let's break down what White's doing a little more. First and foremost, what's important here is the rhythm. It's less about the notes he's playing. It's more about keeping the drive of things going. And it brings up a historical point about how these players are playing in context. As the bands were growing in size, the guitar was fighting more and more to be heard. Guitar makers during this period started making larger instruments, but guitar players started developing ways to cut above the rest of the crowd. In White's case, he's playing single notes, but doing so in a highly rhythmic manner. So again, over the G, he's focusing on a single string, which is very rare for the era, particularly in a big band context. Answering all of Thomas's lines in D, White starts by emphasizing this high G note, about as high as you could play on a non-cutaway archtop in 1934, and then works his way down to open string playing. But I think the important thing for us to pick up on is his rhythm. And to get that rhythm, I often find it important or helpful to just practice playing on one string. So to get the I usually break it down even further and just play that same rhythmic motif without fretting any notes. The other benefit of doing this is practicing just hitting the one string. Now, White knew, as we know, that he can hit this B string and it's still in the G chord. So we're not overly concerned about just getting that high string, but always let's strive to be as accurate as possible. So practice the rhythm a few times. Again, using alternating picking, much like a banjo player would. And let's just try that a little bit slower. Now, you will hear that there's a slight bend, and this brings in some other elements of playing that a lot of these players had at the time. Blues elements, folk elements, things like this that often are not thought of as part of the jazz tradition. But another reason to dig into the players of this era is the fact that a lot of them brought in these other influences, and this was reflected in their playing. The second response to the flute has a couple chordal figures, heavily tremoloed. Again, very similar to what a banjo break would have sounded like a few years earlier. These are both diminished chords. The first one's played up here at the 12th fret. The second one is down here at the 9th fret. So let's talk a little bit about tremolo. For most of us, it's a challenge. And the way to build good tremolo is to, first of all, practice with a pick that's slightly of a lighter gauge than you're used to. Start slow, work towards accuracy, and build up speed. Most important when you're playing tremolo live or playing with a group or trying to play at tempo is to keep your wrist very, very loose. You want this action. And this is where the momentum's coming from. But the last thing that you want is for your wrist, your upper arm to stiffen up. So let's do this a bit slow. We're going to be using this tremolo effect, and then we're going to go back to that single string approach with a very similar to rhythm that he used during the first break. I'll do it again. Now keep in mind the song form goes into a dominant, E dominant chord. So the last note that he hits in this segment wants to at least point towards that, which is why he lands on this A. So let's do it one more time at tempo. Hopefully bring some of these elements together. 1, 2. Our final guitar player today is Al Casey. Casey was several years younger than Freddie Green, but managed to get a bit of a head start due to his early association with Fats Waller. The piano player, songwriter, and vocalist discovered Casey while he was still in high school, and Al joined Fats' band right after graduation. Fortunately for us, Al Casey recorded dozens of titles with Fats Waller for Victor Records during the 1930s. These records give a great example of how to play guitar in a small swing era styled rhythm combo. Casey is often featured either during solo breaks or playing behind Fats in obbligato. Certain elements of Casey's playing are absolutely essential to swing era rhythm guitar playing, as well as chord melody playing. Our final example is taken from the 1937 recording of Fats Waller's own Blue Turning Gray Over You. On the Victor record, Al Casey has an entire chorus of chord melody solo. This is virtually unheard of during those days, when the guitar was usually consigned to 4 bars, maybe 8 bars, if the guitarist was lucky. The entire solo is stuffed full of Al Casey-isms and well worth your study. But let's focus on the last 8 bars of Casey's solo. Before I play it at tempo, let's talk about a couple of the devices that you're going to hear. In addition to the chromaticism that we've heard in some of these other examples, Casey often relies on 9th chords as well as alternating 13th chords, using them as the main building blocks of his solo. Let's have a listen. I'm going to play the progression once just to give us some context of what we're soloing over. 2, a C, E dominant, C, A7, D7, G7, C, D7. And here's Casey's last 8 bars over that same progression. 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a nice relaxed tempo, but let's break it down at a bit of a slower pace just to see what he's doing. Over the C, we hear him doing chromatic movements in two positions. Up high on the top three strings, moving up to the C that we can make here at the 12th fret. And then dropping down to a 3-note C chord, landing here on the 7th fret, again using just the top three strings. He then lands on that C6 chord that I talked about at the very beginning of today's talk, before playing a 4-note dominant 7 chord up here at the B. So let's hear that whole segment again. For the next bit, Casey plays around with the kind of what he can get away with here in the C chord by moving up to the 6 before throwing in a dominant 7 right before he makes the change up to this A. Before I play that more at tempo, let's talk about something Casey often does when he's playing dominant chords. He'll often play a 4-note dominant chord, in this case an A, based on the top 4 strings of the guitar. And he'll stay on the A, moving through the chord, just adding color notes. So whether a flat 9 or the flat 7. Doing so in a rhythmic fashion to give kind of the illusion of movement rather than moving through additional chord forms. So let's hear that a little more at tempo. Again, using the same 3-note chord on the first 3 strings, Casey shows us how to use the same form and turn it into the dominant 9. In this case, we're playing around with a D7 chord or a D9 chord, but we're just again playing the top 3 strings. And there's that little 9th device that Casey uses so often. Before we leave this tune, let's talk a little bit about this very last figure he plays. It's very much Al Casey in that it's a bit of a tricky rhythm figure, a bit of a flashy rhythm figure, and frankly, a little hard to pull off well and at tempo. And as I said earlier, the most important thing that any of us can do when we're approaching this material is to make sure we never lose sight of the pulse of the song. So even while we're trying to pull off some of these tricky figures or some of these syncopations and offbeats, make sure we think about the pulse of the tune in mind and always focus on playing rhythmically and precise. That said, let's take a look at this figure. I'm using that same 3-note chord and I'm sliding up from the 3rd fret, 4th fret to the 5th fret. And I'm striking it hard enough the first time that it will give me enough pull to the 2nd position, but then striking it twice in the 3rd position, kind of giving a little syncopation stroke. So, as such. If this is something I was practicing at home, I would just take this figure itself and just play it ad nauseum. So let's play that again at tempo and hear how it sounds. And true to form, Al Casey lands up here with the same 3-note chord form at the 10th fret, in this case, functioning as a G7, setting us up to go back to C. Let me play that one more time at tempo. So this has been a small look into the world from which Freddie Green emerged. The tradition of swing guitar playing, particularly in Harlem during the 1930s, was a very rich one and a very diverse one. The African American innovators had several different approaches to this music, some of which we looked at today. For his part, Freddie continued to work throughout the New York area, both in Harlem as well as downtown, until he joined Count Basie in 1937 and made his recording debut around the same time. You can hear elements of some of this Harlem rhythm playing in early Count Basie records, early Count Basie radio broadcasts, as well as a few of the very rare Freddie Green chordal solos that come from the same period. Have a listen to Freddie Green on Benny Goodman's version of Honeysuckle Rose from the 1938 Carnegie Hall concert. Or better yet, give a listen to Pee Wee Russell's version of Dinah from 1938, which features a Freddie Green chord solo. A partial transcription of that recording is included in the article that accompanies this video. I hope, like me, you find a lot of inspiration, not only in the music and artistry of Freddie Green, but in the rich, great tradition of these Harlem swing era rhythm guitar players.